There are restaurants in this city where the waiting list is longer than most people's engagements, where the sommelier earns more than a schoolteacher, and where the lighting is kept just dim enough that no one has to see the price on the bill too clearly. Aubergine & Co. was that kind of place. It occupied the ground floor of a converted Gilded Age bank on the Upper East Side, and the marble columns were original, and the ceiling rose 40 feet above the dining room floor, and the whole effect was designed to make you feel, the moment you walked in, that money was not merely welcome here. It was expected. Reeve Ashton had worked there for 2 years. She carried her notepad in the front pocket of her apron, the way other women carried a phone, reflexively, always. She could recite the entire tasting menu from memory, including the supplemental truffle course and the 3 substitutions the kitchen allowed for dietary restrictions. She knew that Mr. Castellanos at table 4 wanted his still water at exactly 62 degrees, not cold, not room temperature, 62. And she knew that the couple who came in every 3rd Friday and always ordered the duck were going through a quiet divorce that neither of them had announced yet, and she knew this because she paid attention, because paying attention was the only thing that gave her any control over the 12 by 20-foot section of the world she inhabited for 8 hours a night. She did not tell people what she had studied. It came up sometimes. A guest would ask, the way guests sometimes do when they feel warmly toward their server, and she would give a small smile and say something vague about school not quite working out. And then she would redirect the conversation back to the menu, because that was easier than explaining the whole of it. The whole of it being 4 years at Columbia on a partial scholarship, a double major in comparative literature and linguistics, a thesis in progress on the structural parallels between Basque and the Kartvelian language family, and then her mother's diagnosis in the fall of her junior year, and then the medical bills, and then the decision that had not felt like a decision at all, more like gravity, like the only direction available. She had left in March of that year. She had told herself it was temporary. That was 4 years ago. The reservation for table 7 came in under the name Hargrove. Party of 3, 9 o'clock, the notes said, preferred the captain's section, requested the Krug Klostu Mesnil if available, no dietary restrictions on file. Reeve had seen the name before, not in the reservation system, but in the financial press. Garrett Hargrove was not quite a household name, but he was the kind of man who appeared on the covers of certain magazines that sat on the coffee tables of other men who were also, in various ways, powerful. He had made his money in logistics, specifically in the particular and unglamorous business of knowing where things were and when they would arrive, which turned out to be worth several $billion in the age of e-commerce. He was 53. He had been married twice. His current net worth, according to the last profile Reeve had read, was somewhere north of $4 billion, though the journalist had noted he was cagey about specifics. He arrived 7 minutes early, which was itself a kind of power move, because early guests in a restaurant like this required the staff to be ready before they were ready, which was almost never possible. He was shorter than she expected. They usually were. He wore a dark suit with no tie, the collar open, the kind of casual that costs more to achieve than formal, and he was accompanied by a man Reeve recognized as his general counsel, a tall, expressionless person named Whitfield, who had been photographed at various ribbon cuttings. And a woman Reeve did not recognize at all, which was interesting because Reeve usually recognized the guests, at least by type. The woman was perhaps 40, impeccably dressed, and carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who did not need to perform authority because authority was simply her natural state. She sat down, without looking at the room. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome to Aubergine. My name is Reeve. I'll be taking care of you tonight." Hargrove looked at her the way certain men look at waitstaff, not unkindly, exactly, but with a flatness of regard that communicated, clearly and without malice, that he was aware of the difference between them and found it unremarkable. He picked up the menu. "We'll start with the Krug," he said, without looking up. "The Clos du Mesnil, not the Grand Cuvée." "Of course. I have a 2012 reserved for the table. Would you like a moment with the menu, or are you ready for the tasting?" "A moment," said the woman. She glanced up at Reeve briefly. Her eyes were a very pale grey, and her assessment was quick and thorough and completely neutral. "Thank you." Reeve nodded and withdrew. By the time she returned with the champagne, the table had settled into a conversation that seemed to be going well. Whitfield was saying something about regulatory timelines. Hargrove was nodding. The woman, whose name Reeve had not yet caught, was writing something in a small leather notebook. Reeve presented the Krug, opened it, poured the first taste for Hargrove. He swirled it once, barely, and nodded. She poured the table. "Tell me," Hargrove said, as she was reaching for the bottle to set it in the ice, "do you know what this champagne costs per bottle?" Reeve paused. The question was not asked the way a curious person asks a question. It was asked the way a man asks a question when he already knows the answer and is interested in whether you do. "The 2012 Krug Clos du Mesnil retails around 900, she said, "though we carry it at 1250. It's one of the rarest single vineyard champagnes produced. The Clos du Mesnil is a walled vineyard in the heart of Le Mesnil-sur-Auger, roughly 4.5 acres. The 2012 was an exceptional year. Good acid structure, very long finish." Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man recalibrating. "You know your wine," he said. "It helps to," said Reeve. "Can I tell you about tonight's menu?" She did. She described each course with the kind of precision that comes not from rote memorization, but from genuine curiosity. She had asked the chef early in her tenure about every dish, not because she was required to, but because she had wanted to know, because wanting to know things was simply how she was built. She described the preparation of the dry-aged Côte de Bœuf and the provenance of the black garlic and the particular quality of the sea urchin from the waters off Hokkaido that the kitchen had been working with this season. Hargrove listened with more attention than she expected. The woman in grey was watching Reeve with an expression that was hard to read. They ordered. The evening proceeded. It was during the second course that things shifted. Hargrove had been drinking steadily, not heavily, but with the deliberate pace of a man who uses alcohol the way others use a remote control to adjust the temperature of a room. He had grown louder. His stories had grown longer. Whitfield laughed at all of them, which was his job. The woman in grey had grown quieter, which seemed to be her nature. Hargrove was telling a story about a deal he had closed in San Sebastian some years ago, when he glanced at Reeve. She was refilling the water and seemed to make a decision. He said something to her in Basque. It was not an accident. He waited after with the specific alertness of someone who has thrown a ball and is watching to see how far it falls. Reeve understood him. She understood him perfectly. He had said, in Euskara, the language of the Basque people, one of the oldest and most linguistically isolated languages in the world, with no known relation to any other living tongue, he had asked her to bring him more bread. He had phrased it the way you phrase things when you want to show off the phrasing, with a particular flourish that suggested he had learned from a private tutor or a very patient local. The table had gone quiet. Whitfield was watching. The woman in grey had looked up from her notebook. Reeve set down the water pitcher. She answered him in Basque. She told him the bread was already on its way, that the kitchen had prepared a fresh batch of the olive sourdough he seemed to have enjoyed, and that if he preferred the rye, she could arrange that as well. She said it in clean, unaccented Euskara, with the particular syntactical structure of the northern dialect, the one spoken closest to the French border, the one that appears in the oldest written texts. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one that had preceded it. Hargrove stared at her. "You speak Basque," he said, in English. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. "I do," she said. "Your bread will be right out." She picked up the water pitcher and moved to the next table without looking back. She could feel the attention of table 7 for the rest of the service, in the way you feel a draught from a window you cannot see. She was aware of Hargrove watching her as she moved. She was aware of the woman in grey watching Hargrove. She refilled glasses. She cleared plates. She described the dessert course with the same unhurried precision she had brought to everything else. She was aware that Hargrove was going to say something, and she was waiting for it, the way you wait for weather you can see coming from a long way off. It came during the cheese course. He had been telling Whitfield something about a transaction, and then he stopped, mid-sentence, and turned to Reeve. "How," he said, "does a waitress speak Basque?" The word sat on the table between them. Not the question, the word, the way he said it. Reeve had heard the word said many ways. She had heard it said kindly, with genuine interest, by guests who had struck up real conversations with her over the years. She had heard it said neutrally, as a simple category. She had heard it said with the particular flatness of someone who had not thought about it at all. She knew which way he had said it now. "My mother is from the Basque country," she said. "I grew up speaking it with her family." And yet, he said, "Here you are." "Here I am," she agreed pleasantly. "I've been to San Sebastian, Donostia, they call it. Beautiful city. We were closing a deal with a shipping concern there. I picked up a few phrases." "So I heard," said Reeve. There was a pause. Whitfield cleared his throat. "The thing is," Hargrove said, leaning back in his chair, which was the posture of a man who had decided the conversation was his to direct, "I went to MIT. My general counsel there went to Yale Law. In this business, the room you're in matters. The table you sit at matters." He looked at her directly. "I'm just curious what brings someone with your evident capability to this particular table." Reeve looked at him for a moment. She had a policy about this. The policy was, don't. Don't explain. Don't justify. Don't give him the biography he's asking for. Because what he's asking for isn't information. It's a concession. He wants to see you flinch. He wants to watch you situate yourself below him, confirm what he already decided the moment you walked up with the notepad and the apron. But then she thought of something else. She thought of the woman in grey, who had been watching this whole exchange with the expression of someone taking very careful notes, and she decided that the truth, spoken plainly, was not the same thing as a concession. "I was finishing my thesis at Columbia," she said, "on comparative linguistics, specifically on the structural relationship between Euskara and the Kartvelian language family, Georgian, Mingrelian, Svan. It's a fringe theory, but there's mounting evidence for contact between the populations in the pre-Neolithic period, which would explain certain grammatical parallels that don't appear in any of the Indo-European branches." She paused. "My mother was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer in November of my junior year. I took a leave of absence to help manage her care, and then her treatment costs exceeded what our family could cover, and then the leave of absence became permanent. I needed a job with good hours, good tips, and the flexibility to be at the hospital when I needed to be." She looked around the room, genuinely. This place offered all three. The table was quiet. "So," she said, "to answer your question, This is exactly where someone with my particular circumstances ends up. Is there anything else I can bring you?" Hargrove opened his mouth, then he closed it. "Just the check," said the woman in grey. Her voice was very calm. Her name, Reeve, learned later, much later, from the manager, who had been told by the reservation coordinator who had taken the follow-up call the next morning, was Evangeline Marsh. She was the CEO of a company called Kinsley Meridian, which was a private equity firm with approximately $30 billion in assets under management, and which had been in early-stage conversations with Hargrove's logistics company about a significant acquisition. The dinner, apparently, had been the social precursor to those conversations. Reeve did not learn any of this that night. That night, she cleared the table, thanked the guests for coming, and wished them a pleasant evening. Hargrove left without speaking to her again. Whitfield left a 17% tip, which told her everything she needed to know about him. The woman in grey, Evangeline, paused on her way out and pressed a card into Reeve's hand without breaking her stride. Reeve looked at the card after the table was cleared. On the front, a name and a title and an email address, clean sans serif on creamstock. On the back, in handwriting that was small and precise, "Call me. I mean it." She didn't call for a week. She told herself she was busy. Her mother had a follow-up appointment. She had a double shift on Thursday. There was always something. But the real reason, which she admitted to herself on the subway home late one night, with the honesty that only comes at the end of a long shift, was that she was afraid, not of Evangeline Marsh, of what the call might mean, of what it might lead to, of the gap between where she was and where she might have been, and how strange and frightening it was to have that gap suddenly visible again. After she had spent 4 years very carefully not looking at it, she called on a Tuesday afternoon from a bench in Carl Schurz Park, watching the river. "I was starting to think you'd lost the card," she said. "I almost did," said Reeve. A pause. A kind of warmth in it. "I want to ask you something," Evangeline said, "and I want you to understand that I'm not asking it the way Garrett asked it. I don't want the story to confirm anything I already think. I just want to know because I'm actually curious." "Okay," said Reeve. "What was your thesis about? Really about? Not the summary version." Reeve looked at the river for a moment. "There's a theory," she said, "that Basque, Euskara, is what linguists call a language isolate, completely unrelated to anything around it. No known parent language, no known siblings. It survived because the Basques were geographically isolated for long enough that the Indo-European expansion that replaced every other pre-existing European language just didn't reach them." She paused. "But there are some researchers, a small group, mostly in Tbilisi and at a few universities in the Pyrenees, who think that's not quite right. That there are traces in the deep grammar, in the verb morphology specifically, that match patterns in the South Caucasian languages, Georgian, Svan, which would mean that before the Neolithic there was a much wider family. A language, or a cluster of languages, spoken across a huge swath of what is now Europe and the Caucasus, and that Basque and Georgian are its last living relatives. Silence on the line. "So they found each other," Evangeline said. Reeve paused. "What? The languages? After all that time, separated, changed almost beyond recognition, the researchers found the traces, proved they came from the same place." Reeve felt something catch in her chest. "Yes," she said, "that's one way to put it." The offer came 3 weeks later, in a letter printed on Kinsley Meridian letterhead, formal and complete with salary and benefits and a starting date. The role was in their portfolio analytics division, specifically in their emerging markets language intelligence team, which tracked and analyzed communications across 19 languages in the logistics sector, which Evangeline was expanding aggressively. It was not the thesis. It was not the academic career that might have been. But it was a room, and it was a table, and it was, Reeve thought, the kind of opportunity that only comes to you when you've spent long enough standing at the edge of other people's tables that you understand, with a precision no classroom can teach, exactly what goes on inside them. She wrote back the same afternoon. She said yes. On her last night at Aubergine, she finished her shift, changed out of her uniform in the small staff room in the back, and walked out through the kitchen the way she always did. The sous chef, a young man named Declan, who had been there 6 months and who she had quietly helped through the first terrifying weeks by explaining, one night over family meal, which guests to watch and which to ignore, looked up from the mise-en-place and said, "You're really leaving?" "I really am," she said. "That woman from 3 weeks ago, the one who left you the card." Reeve smiled. "Yeah." Declan shook his head slowly, the way young people shake their heads when the world behaves in ways they hadn't calculated for. "What are the odds?" he said. Reeve thought about that. She thought about Basque, about a language that survived 10,000 years by accident of geography. She thought about her mother, who had taught her to conjugate verbs in Euskara at the kitchen table in their apartment in Washington Heights 2 decades ago, as a game, as a way of keeping something alive that might otherwise have been lost. She thought about Garrett Hargrove, who had walked into a room and seen a waitress, and had used the rarest tool in his repertoire to confirm that she was small, and had instead revealed, with remarkable efficiency, exactly how small he was. "Honestly," she said, "I stopped thinking in terms of odds a long time ago." She picked up her bag. "You just do the work in front of you, and you do it well, and you try not to let the room make you forget who you are. The rest has a way of catching up." She pushed through the kitchen door, out into the cold spring night, and walked east toward the subway, the city loud and indifferent around her, the river 2 blocks away in the dark, and somewhere across it, across the water, across the long stretch of everything that had come before. Her mother's voice on the phone that morning, tired and warm, saying Eskerrik asko, "Thank you," the old way, the first language way, and Reeve had said it back, the same words in the same language, spoken across the distance and the years and everything in between. Still alive, both of them, still here.